Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Wîcihitowin 2020. I'm so pleased to introduce Elder Maria Linklater, who's going to start us off in the most beautiful way with a prayer. Maria.
Hei, nena nasko mun kahki joki vojohtse. Pomotsi kisikau. Ehawi kuusia kattoa katuutta mahti koi. Eba kaka meimoja. Kun ja eba minä Wîcihitowin oma. Enne hioja ka Wîcihito. Nato kei tehtaa kokoma pikskon Wîcihitowin joka kami Wîcihitowin minä. Ka Wîcihaya ko taisi nimno. Eba Niigaan ka Wîcihitowin kat peitsikin. Wîchihinan kattoa katuutta mahti koi. Ega minäkin kuinka vatsnaks kamasua kui pähmoonankin kuinka aika mias kavitauks kagoja. Haima kavi miaja kat pihtsikeng staatusia on evota. Askuiksi vehtämme. Mä katsoin miaja, kun taas sinä pissa kat miaja. Joka pukanmakin kavi tsisua kat pihtsikeng skeitene vananma. Ja minä vasta koska pikskasta mogi kat pihtsikeng. Kega Wîcihitowin pista aika mistake kun tänä miku hai. Mutta maskikin on haja kun teisi nimnä. Missä tostaike on haja kun Niigaan niikote kehte kanote päivä. Ai sama suma ja. Ai siinä kun eutin kun sivu maskikin hatit eutin kun se katpiitsikin. Mä kun miia he vanan tansikes Wîcihitoa he vanan ohse. Sankia oema mugetike aiman. Ja minä kehteekään, kis musta muokikaan piitsikein sueskamik. Ja kis mut ottamaan aski, kun mi Wîcihitowin minä. Vassakan kauin anaski, kun näs humtenosse. Kiau emia, kun mitsua alkoisa, kun minä nippi. Ja usna näs humtankaan piitsikein. Kiko Wîcihia, ke haima akuma matsuun, ja vahannoskaa kiskaa. Mä kenen asumaan Wîcihitowin. Uppikin hausuun kat piitsikein ka Wîcihia. Epsin sinä asumaan kieki koskat piitsikein. Hainan asumaan.
Thank you, Elder Maria Linklater. We would just like everybody to ask everybody to please join us for a moment of silence to remember all of those who didn't come home from the schools. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us today at Wîcihitowin 2020. My name is Niigaan. I'd just like to offer this protocol and this tobacco to my dad, Gilbert Kiwistep, to offer a couple of words for us today to start us off again, following Elder Linklater.
Hey, Rich, thank you very much. I accept this tobacco very humbly in that, and I said my prayer earlier in that through the teachings of my father, and that he told me to, when you pray for others in that, pray from the heart and try not to use any kind of mics or any kind of visual effects in that when you say the prayer in that. That's it. But I want to open by being asked to be here for the 6th year. Again, I must say that this journey began 6 years ago with 4 young men that had a vision to remember the past, to remember those that went to these schools that really harmed our people. They wanted to also make people aware that they were not forgotten, and the children after them as well that came. I said my prayer this morning to my fellow elders, those that I walk with today. I said my prayers for those families that lost their loved ones along the way. So today I'm very humbled to be here with you in that, far and wide. My prayers go out to you as well. During this time, the stressful time that we're having around the world, prayed for our elders so that we see them for a long time yet. I prayed for our young ones that are going to school, to the schools, that they come home to us safe. I prayed for all the workers that have put this together throughout the 6 years. Worked so hard in that to get this message across. Again, I want to thank everybody that's joined us during this time and that. And I know, again, I'm very humbled, and I thank you all for being here with us. So that it's enough coming in the way Magana. Thank you all, my friends. You may go ahead, say hey.
Welcome to the 2020 Wîcihitowin Conference. Thank you for joining us from all around the world. You are live from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis right here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, from beautiful Wîcihitowin Heritage Park. We are in a year of a pandemic, and what better way to bring some beautiful healing with some dancing and some singing. We have our dancers who are demonstrating the women's jingle dress dance style for everybody watching. The dance style originated during a time of hardship for our people, and is understood that the medicine dress will bring healing to the people. So the sounds that these jingle dress make, they cleanse the atmosphere, they cleanse the people. And so with the singing accompanied with the dancing, we have some very powerful movement ready for you. So with that, we have our singers, the Walking Buffalo Singers from right here, Treaty 6 territories, joining us. Walking Buffalo Singers, let's give these dancers something to dance to.
Hey,
Hi there. Welcome to Wîcihitowin 2020. I'd like to thank Elders Maria Linklater and Gilbert Kewstep. Gilbert Kewstep, for those of you that don't know, is my dad. I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go. But for those of you that have joined Wîcihitowin over the years, you'll know that that comfort always wasn't there for me. But I'll tell a nice story, and I think this year, more than any, is a pretty fitting year for that story to be told today. So I'm Neil Kewstep. I work with the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy with the University of Saskatchewan and University of Regina, respectively. And this is my colleague, April Sora. I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. As usual, as in the past 5 years, and this is now our 6th, we are so pleased to welcome everybody, and this time from really across the world. It is so exciting for us to be here. My name is April Sora, and I am the Immigration, Diversity, and Inclusion Consultant with the City of Saskatoon, and very pleased to be representing the City of Saskatoon. I'd also like to give my thanks to Elder Maria Linklater and Elder Gilbert Kewstep. For me, there's nothing like having the elders open us up for these 2 days in such a good way. I don't think we could do it without them. It really helps to calm everybody here. I'd also like to thank our dancers in our opening video, TJ Warren, the Walking Buffalo Singers, and the Jingle Dress dancers. So the dancers were Dabney Warren, Omiyasu Warren, Lacey Albert, and Landis Rowan Albert. And as TJ mentioned in the introduction, the dance style originated during a time of hardship. And I think with the theme of this Wîcihitowin 2020 of coming through the fire, I think that it's very fitting that we opened with such a beautiful dance out at Wîcihitowin Heritage Park. I don't think a year ago we would have ever imagined that we would have been here in a very small room with very few people, Neil and I distancing ourselves as we are, but it is, again, in another way, so wonderful that we can welcome everybody from across the world.
Yeah, April, that's one of the neat things as I was thinking about this conference in particular was, I know that my dad, when he opened the conference this morning, he alluded to kind of the early days of when Wîcihitowin was envisioned. And as I was reflecting on today and kind of where we've come, this is, when I could see one of another colleague and co-founder, Brad Bird, in the room with us. And this is actually, to be honest, April, this is exactly, I think, what I thought Wîcihitowin was going to be when we first started. I thought it was going to be me talking in a room full of 5 people. And really that's, I think, what we kind of thought it was going to be, but it's turned into this, I think it was exciting as we were counting down, going live, and we seen the numbers kind of going up, and Brad and I were getting excited. Like when this thing started, we didn't imagine anyone would come, I think I'm full of hot air and lots of bad jokes, and we knew a few people would show up, but would they keep coming, and that's one of the things we worried about. But this thing has only grown over the years, and I think, it's, you got to have more than corny jokes and a nice haircut sometimes. I think, so one of the things that we knew we needed to do to keep this audience engaged, to keep the conversation alive, and to do justice to the voices that we just had here. Those elders, not only are they elders and leaders in our community, they are leaders. They're leaders in our community, and so we all follow them. Part of my role and lots of our roles here is we're helpers, and so whatever they tell us to do and wherever they tell us to go, it's our job in all of our respective roles and organizations, that we take that direction and we work towards those outcomes, we work towards those dreams that they give us, right? So that's what Wîcihitowin is about. We're so thankful this year, that we've got pretty much every province and territory in the country represented, but not only that, we've got four different continents at my last check that were here. So super exciting, and we couldn't have dreamed that it would be this. And this is our first virtual land-based conference. You know, we're excited to have that. We didn't even think that would be a part of this thing, right? So it's only grown, and I think I'm really excited to see where it grows after this, you know? So as we were coming up and thinking about the theme, Through the Fire, it just naturally came. Like many things at the Wîcihitowin table, this is just how it comes. When you surround yourself with good team and good leadership, as long as you're prepared to listen and learn, that's kind of been the story of Wîcihitowin. But I think, you know, I'm going to have a lot of time to ramble on over the next couple of days, April. We've got a really great program scheduled for everybody. I see many folks that are still logging in and signing in, so I'm really pleased to see that everybody's navigating their way through the technology.
And maybe, you know, for some people who, if this is the first time that they're joining us for Wîcihitowin, just to let them know that Wîcihitowin is a Cree and Saulteaux word. And it means that they come together. And I think there's no better word, really. And I think it's even more significant this year when so many of us couldn't come together in person, that we're able to come together virtually and still share teachings and still share the learnings from elders, and also that even more people across the world will know the story of survivors of residential schools. And really, I think that's what we need to keep coming back to for the next 2 days, Neil, is really that's why we're here. We're here for the survivors, and we're here for those who never came home. So Wîcihitowin is a very, very special word for all of us here in Saskatoon. And for the last 6 years especially, we've really taken it to heart in the work that's been put into this conference from so many people on the coordinating committee.
Yes, thank you very much, April. But again, without further ado, I want to start going into our videos. But one very special person, you know, that joined us last year. He joined the Wîcihitowin Circle, and we're really just honored, you know, that is actually how we introduced this next individual. We will respect the title that he's earned. But one of the personal messages that I wanted to share was just what it meant to us, you know, and as for Indigenous people, you know, that's who we were, that's who we are. We're still to this day, just with an idea of a better tomorrow. That's all this thing started, was how could we make a better tomorrow? Well, what could we do in our respective work roles? And it started in a little cafe in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, this idea, and it's turned in and grown into what it is today. And as we kind of go into this next presenter, again, I like listening to the Lieutenant Governor's story. You know, Russ Marasti is his name. We have a formal introduction for him, but I think the personal connection, you know, I think he's an Indigenous man from northern Saskatchewan. He was the leader of F Division troop for the RCMP. That's, you know, one of the things that he accomplished in his career. But he's the Queen's representative for Saskatchewan, you know, and he wanted to be here. You know, he wanted to be a part of this conversation, you know, and it's just, that's kind of been our story, April, you know. I think as we just have so many, once we tell people what we're doing, once we show them who we're doing it for, is they all just want to help, you know, and our circle only continues to grow. And I hope it continues to grow even and further after this. We're reaching audiences that we never dreamed we could reach, you know. So, and we're talking about reconciliation, you know. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you His Honor, the Honorable Russ Marasti, Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan.
Tansi, nuahumarantig, minanto timitig. Hello, relatives and friends. Thank you to the elders and knowledge keepers. I'm grateful for this opportunity to bring greetings to everyone participating in the Wîcihitowin 2020 conference. Dawn and I attended the event last year in Saskatoon, and we were touched by the reception we received and very impressed by the thought-provoking and inspiring presentations. We're looking forward to this year's online sessions. Organizers have chosen a very relevant and timely theme, Through the Fire, which reflects on the global pandemic and how we might look at the pandemic through an Indigenous lens. Indigenous teachings, specifically the concept of Wîcihitowin, meaning everything is related, is very important as we look to overcome this current challenge. It is equally important as we continue the work relative to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Only by recognizing and accepting that we are all connected in some way will we be able to work together more effectively to overcome our challenges and to complete the work that needs to be done. No individual or community can or should stand alone to create that positive change that we all desire. I feel very fortunate that I was born and raised in the North, where my ancestors have lived for generations. My grandparents spoke only Cree, and it was my first language. Language shapes our worldview. I grew up speaking Woodland Cree, and this has influenced my identity, my values, and my perspectives. I also benefited from going to school and gaining a broader understanding of the world beyond where I grew up. This broader understanding has helped me during my journey. In addition to speaking Cree, my grandparents lived a traditional lifestyle: hunting, trapping, fishing, and gathering. They spent a great deal of time on the land, the lakes, and rivers. This connection to nature and deep appreciation for it was passed down to me. I love to spend time outside, particularly in the North, and I never take for granted its beauty and serenity. I am at times reminded by others of the same thinking. A good friend of mine, non-Indigenous, who I've spent many hours running and cross-country skiing with in the North, calls it good medicine. I couldn't agree more. With increasing interest in land-based education, it's clear that many people are seeing value in connecting or reconnecting with the natural world. I'm very grateful to have that connection, and I believe that all of us, especially children, would benefit from spending more time in the outdoors. In Saskatchewan, nature is not far from any of us. One of the positive impacts of the pandemic that I have observed, especially in the cities, has been that many people are spending more time going for a walk in their neighborhood. This simple act can have many positive effects, from getting to know your neighbors to improve physical and mental well-being, and even connecting with nature. COVID-19 is a very serious challenge, and although we have done quite well here in Saskatchewan, we must remain diligent. We need to continue to do everything we can to protect the most vulnerable, including our elders. I want to thank everyone for working together to reduce the spread of COVID. Challenges like the pandemic force us to re-examine many things we took for granted. Simple things like getting groceries, visiting friends, or going to school. The pandemic has also drawn attention to many inequities. It has impacted the poor and other disadvantaged groups disproportionately. Change is not easy, and solutions to long-term problems are rarely obvious. But I sincerely hope that this global crisis will be a catalyst for change. My ancestors were very resilient people who survived residential schools and many harmful policies. We have much to learn from them about resilience. I want to thank the organizers and all the conference presenters for sharing their perspectives. Thank you for bringing us together online and for inspiring us to consider how to see this difficult time as an opportunity to make things better, together. I will close by bringing greetings on behalf of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada. I'd also like to share these greetings in Woodland Cree. Elizabeth II. Kigi Sogamaskuno, Utagitaskino, Canada. Ninanaskamun.
I'd like to really thank Lieutenant Governor Russ Morasti for those very, very fitting words for our conference today. When he talked about Wîcihitowin and meaning everything is related, and throughout his life, how his land-based learnings and his learnings from his family stayed with him in everything that he did. And so that whole idea of everything is related all comes back to him in his adult life as well. As he was hunting and trapping and fishing, and he learned all of those skills He said that, those are just so important and significant to him. I also really appreciated, Neil, that he ended in his language. I think language is another part and something else that you'll see is another theme throughout this conference, the importance of language and how interrelated it is with culture and identity.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And one thing I just again wanted to send my thank you to His Honor Russ Morasti and her Honor Donna Morasti too. We're really looking forward to sharing hugs and actually meeting again when it's safe to do so. Some of the other things I think, just to follow up with what April said as far as kind of a connection and the theme of language itself is I think, there's been a lot of scary things that have happened as a result of this pandemic, and a lot of major changes that have occurred in the world. And I think, that's one of the neat things that His Honor kind of mentions is some of those repercussions I think, that we're now dealing with, but also some of the silver lining. I think, that's there's a lot of lessons that this pandemic has actually brought forth and put at the forefront of our minds, and that reconnecting, that reconnection to those teachings, to that history, to those people, that really gave them this foundation for life. So for me, I think those are definitely some of the things that were new as well too. I think, with the slowdown in the world that nobody could have anticipated in any of our lifetimes. I think that I hope a lot of us got to experience that reconnection as well too. So that's something that I really it just resonated with me when I heard his comments. But again, I want to keep going back to that and that theme of language,
Absolutely.
reconnecting, interconnectedness between each other and our environment. So those are really important things. So you were gonna say something, April, sorry?
Well, I was just going to say too that, time and again, we know that over the years, we reconnect also with people at this conference, and it's such a special time for us. And we're just so grateful for those investors that have stood beside us. And honestly, there is no way we could do any of this without those investors. And of course, we have the Saskatoon Community Foundation, and also we have Nutrien. And we are just so so pleased and appreciate the support from those investors, as well as, of course, the University of Saskatchewan. And of course, though, we have there are the partner organizations that you actually started with, Neil.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, these things don't happen without the support of all of these investors. So we want to thank our premier investor, obviously Nutrien, the continued support that has been given throughout the years to this conversation, to this work. We just can't thank you enough, and all of us, for making things like this happen. Our family investor, the Saskatoon Community Foundation. Again, we can't thank those enough that have stepped up in our own backyards, to keep these conversations going, who are really excited to bring this conversation really to the world, not just Canada, but to the world. And a partner investor, the University of Saskatchewan. So this year was a little bit different, with it being kind of a pandemic. It was really awkward to try and go and approach people. I think that was one of the most obvious hardships that was clear, was that there was the economy stopped.
Yeah.
And we weren't able to gather. We weren't able to break bread together in public spaces and those types of things. So we really realized pretty quick that we were so connected with each other, right? So that's, I think, going back to the investors and those that have stepped up. I can't say enough on behalf of the committee how thankful we are for the contribution that you've made to make today a reality. So we were a little bit worried at the beginning. There was a lot of cancellations for gatherings and those types of things across the board, right? So I just want to thank everybody in our team for really coming up with this, and for all of our investors, the partner organizations included. So we've got the Saskatoon Public Libraries, the City of Saskatoon, the Saskatchewan Health Authority, Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, and of course, Reconciliation Saskatoon. So without rambling on too much, April, which I tend to do, so April, you can just give me a nudge or give me a kick under this table and I'll be happy to move on. But another person that would like to bring greetings, and welcome everybody to the conversation is from our premier investor from Nutrien, the CEO of Potash, Ken Seitz.
It is an honor to virtually join you on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis in the spirit of resiliency, partnership, and reconciliation. As a leading contributor to the Wîcihitowin Indigenous Engagement Conference, Nutrien is committed to deepening the conversation around reconciliation. Thank you to the elders and knowledge keepers for continuing with their vision of positive change. Nutrien's purpose requires us to be grounded in inclusion and community. We are dedicated to growing the future from the ground up. To do this, we must embrace the principles of Wîcihitowin as part of our ongoing commitment to our Aboriginal strategy. We're the world's largest provider of crop inputs and services, and as such, we have a critical role in feeding the future by helping growers to increase food production in a sustainable manner. By 2050, we'll need to grow food for almost 10 billion people. That's why we're raising expectations on what an agriculture company can be. From the bottom of the mine to the top of the silo, our employees around the world are committed to feeding the future safely and with integrity each day. Nutrien is tied to the land, relying on ancient mineral deposits to feed the world. Understanding this natural ecology and its historical and cultural significance will help us to take care of what we need to operate in a responsible and balanced way. The growing legal recognition and accords for the inherent treaty and global standing of our Aboriginal people impacts our operations locally and globally. As a world leader in agriculture retail, our global network is our opportunity to embody Wîcihitowin, ensuring that reconciliation is attainable and top of mind. And we're learning from one another results in improving our relationships and strengthening our communities. We lead by example, by embedding reconciliation in multiple areas of our corporation through a variety of tools. Our priorities include enhancing education and training, providing direct employment, supporting Aboriginal business development and entrepreneurship, engaging Aboriginal subcontractors, and investing in Aboriginal communities. We support our vast supplier network in prioritizing reconciliation through our Aboriginal Content Playbook, and reward those who answer the calls to action by adapting and adjusting their operations to embrace diversity and inclusion. As a company, Nutrien believes in investing in long-term options that enrich First Nations and Métis heritage, highlighting their relationship with the land. Coming together to acknowledge the value of Wîcihitowin opens the doors to the advancement of reconciliation for each of us personally and deepens our collective understanding of each other as we grow. Living in a time of humanity where COVID-19 has emerged as a shared threat, we take this time to learn and see an opportunity to explore how we approach the future in a collective and more balanced way. This pandemic has shone a light on the vast and immediate impact felt by our most vulnerable communities and ignites an urgent need to redirect our focus on resiliency and sustainability. It is out of the fire that we have the ability to forge a new way forward. So thank you to the many organizers, speakers, and contributors of this important event in its virtual format. And to each of you, be well.
Thank you very much, Ken. For those of you that were paying attention during that very awesome video, a message from Ken, he was also wearing a moose hide, a little square patch of leather there. It's part of the Moose Hide campaign, which is to bring awareness to domestic violence against women. So super awesome video. I loved it. I was actually, for those of you that are going to be joining us again tomorrow, you'll notice some of the clips and some of the footage is actually from our Survivor Circle, which will be tomorrow afternoon's session. So some of the things before we move on is again, I want to thank all of our friends at Nutrien for all of the continued support. But one of the things that I really admire is just Nutrien's commitment to reconciliation and to living and implementing the meaning of Wîcihitowin and Wîcihitowin in its daily business practices and operational philosophy is inspiring to us, you know, and it's really a great example to different organizations just for how you could find yourself embracing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and trying to implement that into your organization. So I want to move on to our next thing. Usually that's the one thing for this early part. I think April and I are usually tripping over each other of just trying to get and keep everything focused and on time. And I think that's a little bit of the luxury that we have this year. See, all the changes haven't been all that bad. So we usually get to save all of our good stuff until the second day. And for those of you that never joined the second day, you missed how deadly April really is. She's really deadly. So, but I am going to let her introduce our next investor. But also we want to give a plug out to our friends over at BATC. So that is Battleford's Agency Tribal Council. So they produce this hand sanitizer, and in this era of pandemic, we want to thank them for supplying us with these goodies to keep our hands clean and keep our nice and safe as well.
And they gave them to all their urban members as well as 2 big boxes of masks. So shout out to you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Good work out in Moosomin First Nation for being part of the Medi Mask thing. So just innovation, lots of innovation happening all across Indigenous communities and lots of good stuff actually coming out of this pretty trying times.
So next, I would like to welcome, words from another community friend, and that's Carm Mikolenko. And if you're in Saskatoon, you know Carm Mikolenko. And it is my great pleasure to be able to welcome her words. I'd also like to say too, you know, I see Carm around in community all the time. Mostly, I often see her at the Reconciliation Saskatoon table. And she's never shy to take part, to offer words, and also to ask questions. Carm is someone who's always willing to learn. And I think, you know, our elders have taught us, Neil, that reconciliation cannot be delegated. It can't be something that we can be told to do. It really needs to come from the heart. And I think Carm Mikolenko is one of those people that often will step forward when no one's asking her to or telling her to. So with that, I would like to introduce Carm Mikolenko, who is the Executive Director of the Saskatoon Community Foundation, another very strong supporter of the Wîcihitowin Conference.
Greetings, Tansi. Welcome from my home here on Treaty 6 territory, traditional homeland of the Métis. I'm Carm Mikolenko with Saskatoon Community Foundation. On behalf of our entire organization, we are very honored to once again be supporting Wîcihitowin. Wîcihitowin, helping one another. I believe that's what it'll take to move forward with this pandemic. And more importantly, to thrive as a society that is much more inclusive so that all feel that we belong. This conference is an important gathering. It's an opportunity where each of us can make a personal commitment to reconciliation. Reconciliation takes courage, and no one voice alone can achieve the goal. But when many voices are together, we can go far. So please enjoy the session, learn that all that it has to offer, and let's ensure that all of Canada can hear the message of reconciliation. Hi, hi.
Thanks so much, Carm. Did you see her bling? April and I also have some Indigenous bling on ourselves. So please, April, what are we wearing?
They're very important too. They are not just bling, although they are beautiful. They're red dresses. And they are to commemorate and remember all the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. And just this past week, we were actually at, I guess it was on Sunday, they had the Sisters in Spirit gathering this year, and it was virtual as well. And just as moving and incredibly, it is very sad. I feel very privileged to be in a city where families come forward year after year and talk about their missing and murdered relatives, and it's just, it's heartbreaking, but I think it's something that across the country, if you're listening, across the world, we need to bring attention to. We can't ignore it. So yeah, we are absolutely wearing these pins, and we'll be wearing them today and tomorrow as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, those are the types of things I think when we envisioned this gathering and this conversation, we would continue to push those types of messages and raise that type of awareness. One of the other things, though, that I think we're really excited to do, I just want to capture a little bit about what Carm, following up on Carm. I think we have a lot of different people joining us from all over the world, all over the country this year, and I think that this conversation started very locally. It started very locally in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, but that it's not stayed here. And a lot of these conditions and the environment and issues, and opportunities are not unique to Saskatoon or Saskatchewan by any means. So I think those, as we may introduce individuals, I think one of the other goals of Wîcihitowin was always to be about what are practical examples that we could actually advance reconciliation, progress on the front of Indigenous engagement, and actually make a better tomorrow. So I think just showing up, I think the first step you can actually do is show up, and so following up on, what I admire about Carm's leadership at the Saskatoon Community Foundation is you show up. And it actually doesn't, you're not delegating that to your employees, who might have the time. You're actually, that's I think why we like the investors is because just showing up is a really good first step. And if you want to show people such as the elders that we have kind of leading and surrounding us, I can't tell you how far your presence actually goes, just showing up. So if you're looking for advice and practical how-tos post Wîcihitowin 2020, I would suggest, April and I are going to do our best to offer those tips and suggestions. But before we jump into our next presenter, and I know you're just itching and dying to get there, but we want to start trending on social media as well too. April needs some friends on her friends list, so she would love for you to add her on some of these social media platforms. So you can follow us on Twitter at Wîcihitowin and you can use the hashtag for today and tomorrow. Please use hashtag Wîcihitowin 2020. So I already got in trouble for that this morning, and I added something really long. My Twitter handle only comes alive nkiwi81 during Wîcihitowin time. So it's kind of like a comment or a Haley's comment or something like that. But if I get enough followers today, I promise I'll say something of substance. But you can also follow us on Facebook at Wîcihitowin and on Instagram at Wîcihitowin. Perfect. There we go. So I wanted to, we're at our first presentation this morning. I am super excited to, I don't even know if everyone even knows who's showing up at the conference. I'm just rambling, trying to build up the anticipation before we get to our first guy. Everyone's just waiting. But we're going to have a break after this, so don't worry. Everyone can stay close and get to refresh. One of the things I'm really excited because one of the first individuals we had opening Wîcihitowin was Senator Marie Sinclair. And one of the things we're going to talk about is interconnectedness and relationships and how important those are to all of us. we're talking about the work of residential school survivors and some of the impacts of intergenerational trauma. But we tend to always look at kind of the negative side, you know, and we focus on some of the deficits that exist in Indigenous communities. But I think for those of you that are working with Indigenous people, wanting to see different things, believe me, there's lots of good stuff there, lots of good stuff. And you know, as we kind of segue into our next presenter, this is an example of lots of that good stuff, you know. I think, you know, our children, you know, are some of the best gifts that we could ever receive in the entire world. And who knows that better than Indigenous people? You know, when in the absence of children in your home and your home fire, I think there's no group in our country that knows that how much that can hurt and the void that actually leaves in a home, an individual, you know, and it's hard to grow. So I think, you know, as we're looking back at the theme of the conference, Through the Fire, that has been some of the fire that Indigenous people and Indigenous communities have come through, you know. But the neat thing, I think, is going back to the message and the theme of Wîcihitowin this year, is that there's always something good on the other side of that fire. You know, it's going to hurt for a while, it's going to sting, but that's the story of Indigenous stories. You know, there's going to be hardship, you know, you're going to go through tough times, but you're going to come out,
And that always
bigger
you come out of it stronger.
and stronger,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And together. So
Yeah.
So going back, yeah, you didn't even know who was presenting, but we knew who was coming, and you joined us anyway. So we want to thank you again for that. But you're going to be super glad you did join, because our first keynote presentation for this morning is none other than Niigaan Sinclair. And Niigaan has a really long and beautiful biography that I want to read, but he's been on the request line for presenters for a really long time. You know, he's carved his own. Although he comes from a home of Catherine and Murray Sinclair. All of the children, you know, of Murray and Catherine have been able to carve their own path in the world and forge and create different opportunities and spaces and conversations themselves. And Niigaan is one of those leaders that has come out. But I want to read his bio, just because it is so good, and it is so. We should all be proud, you know, that these are the types of individuals that our society is now growing, right? So Niigaan Sinclair is a Anishinaabe. He's from St. Peter's and Little Peguis, and he's an associate professor at the University of Manitoba. And he is an award-winning writer, editor, and activist who was named one of Monocle Magazine's Canada's top 20 most influential people. And he won the 2018 Canadian Columnist of the Year at the National Newspaper Awards for his bi-weekly columns in the Winnipeg Free Press. In 2019, he won the Peace Educator of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association, based at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is an international media commentator as part of the Power Panel on CBC's Power and Politics and National Affairs Panel on CBC's The Current. He is also a former secondary school teacher who has trained educators and students across Canada. Please join me in welcoming our first keynote presenter, Niigaan Sinclair.
Bonjour de Magraduk, Niigaan Wêwinam Indigenous Cost Namagoshin Dodem, Niminwendam Omayayan. It's a pleasure to be here at this year's virtual version of the Wîcihitowin conference. And it's a real honor to be here. It's an honor to come to you all the way from Treaty 1 territory, right here in Winnipeg, Manitowoc, this beautiful place that I've called home for all of my life. I want to say greetings, bonjour, tanse, bonjour, hello to everybody who is coming to us from all over the place, all over Turtle Island for this amazing conference. I've always dreamed about being part of Wîcihitowin. However, I always thought it would look a little different than it did for this year, it's gone on virtual, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so that's the reality. And what I always tell everybody at this point is nobody prepares for a pandemic. Nobody sits there and goes, well, next year we're going to have a pandemic. And so the thing that we need right now is patience and understanding between all of us. And so I'm real honored that this year's theme is not only talking about how we deal with pandemics and sickness and emergencies in our communities, but that the theme of Wîcihitowin is such an important theme at this point, to imagine the importance of relatedness and relatedness between all of us, and how we are better when we are together and when we look to each other. And that's what today's theme is going to be about for my talk. So I'm going to open up my screen here, and if you can just bear with me for just a moment. Here we go. So my talk for today is it's called Through Pandemics and Trauma, Why Indigenous Futures Cannot Be Stopped. And like I said, I'm real honored to be here at this amazing conference. And while we may be talking about a time where we're going through the fire, we are people who are thoroughly prepared for the fire. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is about our nations and what we're doing now to be able to engage this. And this is what I do. This is my career. This is who I am. So my name's Niigaan Sinclair, and James Sinclair also. People call me that in my home territory. And I'm an Anishinaabe from Little Peguis Indian Settlement, which is also known as Peguis First Nation, the original site of Peguis First Nation. I'm an associate professor at the University of Manitoba. I'm also a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. So I write a column 2 times a week with the Winnipeg Free Press. You can check it out. I also write for the Globe and Mail, and I appear on CBC Power and Politics weekly for the Power Panel. And I also do a number of other things, including writing and doing a lot of work with teachers and curriculum. And so one of the things that I most often do is I work with a lot of survivors, and I work with previously with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who my father was involved very heavily with. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And of course, all of you survivors out there, a shout out to you. I'm also a father and a parent, and I work in community, and I also work internationally. And so this is a picture of me in the middle here, right up here, of when I spoke at the World Court in the Netherlands, in The Hague. And I also do a lot of community work as well. We're going to hear a little bit about my community work today. And I came from UBC, so I'm very honored to say that I'm part of the original cohort of Indigenous PhDs that the program initiated and started, and sought to create 500 Indigenous PhDs in 5 years. And of course, UBC, being the excellent school that it is, produced that in 3 years, and now is continuing to produce hundreds of Indigenous professionals in workplaces, band offices, community halls, community places, all for many, many years now. So this talk is dedicated, as always, to my children, to the work that I do as a parent, but also as the work that I do as someone who works with young people. So I work, of course, with kind of older people at the university, but I also work with young people in my neighborhood and in my community, especially young men in the jails, who are trying to reintegrate into the community and get in touch with their children and with their families and sometimes their partners. And so this is dedicated to them. And this is the kind of time that we're in. The real time that we're in at the moment is we are in the middle of a pandemic. As I speak to you this evening, I'm speaking to you about a time period in which we are going through thoroughly in most segments of the country a second wave of COVID-19. And in Manitoba, I would actually say we are going through a first wave. We never really went through a first wave in Manitoba because of a number of reasons. We're going to talk about that. But really, the rest of the country is going through major cases, major spikes in cases. Today, it's when I was working on this slide a few days ago. I wouldn't have seen the numbers that came through this morning at Quebec, which was, reaching almost 1,000 of new cases. And, back on when I was making this slide, we were at 148,000 cases, and we seem to be increasing in the thousands every single day across this place called Canada now. And in Manitoba, we are the fastest growing proportional amount of cases across the country. So while we were the lowest amount of cases for a long period of time, we were similar to New Brunswick for a long time. Now Manitoba is leading Canada, and as of tomorrow, the new rules will come into effect where there'll be no more allowed. Masks are mandated at all places, indoors and outdoors, in public spaces, as well as no more than 10 people allowed in a space at any one time. So, I mean, here we are. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and if there's anything that the pandemic has really illustrated to us, it is that where you are situated in this country is how COVID affects you. So while COVID doesn't discriminate, of course, against people, the situation that people are in of discrimination results in a higher exposure rate to COVID-19. And that's what I really want to talk about for today. COVID-19 it is more likely you're going to be exposed to COVID-19 depending on your geographical space, your class space, and your racial space. So these kinds of specific spaces that have been always created, often through oppression and marginalization, these are spaces that result in a higher rate of exposure to COVID-19. And, you know, if you are a Black person, for example, you are more likely to get exposed to COVID-19. If you are a woman, you are more exposed to COVID-19. If you are a Indigenous person, or if you are a rural or urban person, particularly if you're a poor person, you are more likely to be exposed to COVID-19. And let's talk a little bit about that, why that is, and then more importantly, what are people doing about it? Because frankly, everybody expected COVID-19 to devastate and discriminate against Indigenous peoples. I mean, everybody had predicted that early on. I was on media several times speaking about that kind of ongoing challenge that Indigenous peoples were likely going to face as a result of the impacts of the sickness on our communities. And everyone expected COVID-19 to really devastate. And you know, there was most of the evidence that was used to talk about it had to do with history, but also talking about the ways in which Indigenous peoples had been hammered into situations involving poverty, which involves systemic discrimination. The fact is, you know, having access to clean water, overcrowded housing, inability to access health and health resources in communities. If there was an outbreak, then the situation would get exponentially worse. And I don't really have to give you a big history lesson here, although you can see this slide's quite heavy in the history side. But it is to say that for over 150 plus years, actually more like 500 years, Indigenous communities have been steadily driven into a situation that has culminated in this moment. So Indigenous communities are facing the reality of 500 years of oppression that have started with the Papal Bulls way back when the ships of Cartier and Columbus, and then the Royal Proclamation in 1763, where the king says, everybody, all the land is mine and everybody's my subjects, and they have only the rights that I will dictate to them. And then using Terra Nullius, the British North America Act institutes itself by Canada taking control of lands, Indians and lands reserved for Indians, and then the dominoes just fall from there. The Indian Act, treaties, residential school, Indian agents, control of movement and dress. And then, of course, when things are shifted in the 1960s, the removal, the massive removal of children, which results in poverty. Now, what does that look like when you add in a country, when you add in policy and laws? Well, it's much like how we conceive of the residential school system. So the residential school system is pretty easy to understand in that basically the residential school system created a world in which Indigenous peoples were taught to feel inferior, Canadians were taught to feel superior. And that means that, what does that look like in policy? Well, it involves Indigenous languages being marginalized, not included as one of the official languages of Canada. And includes Indigenous peoples being disenfranchised, put under the draconian control of ministry, now 2 ministries. It involves Indigenous peoples constantly being disenfranchised, removed from territories, having their land stolen to the tune of 99% of most of Canada on stolen Indigenous territories. And what does that ultimately look like? Well, it ultimately looks like is one side is the problem, one side is the solution. Of course, all of these are constructed categories. It's a narrative, it's a story. The expectation is that just like in 1919, Indigenous peoples were going to be disproportionately affected by the sickness of COVID-19, but we can look at the Spanish flu of 1919 as kind of a litmus test. And really, Winnipeg, where I am right now in Treaty 1 territory, is kind of a perfect example of what that looks like. In terms of Winnipeg was one of the major hit cities when the Spanish flu kind of swept into North America, Canada. You know, it hit areas like New York and then Toronto. But the reason why Winnipeg is so important to think about is because Winnipeg at that time, and still is in many ways, is the kind of trading hub of the West. I mean, the train lines would come through and then boom, through the imposition of people from the train lines, the sickness traveled very quickly through September and October of 1919 and rapidly spread throughout the city, affecting people, killing thousands. The issue is that it really didn't affect Indigenous peoples until a few months later in February. But when it did hit Indigenous communities, it was devastating. Didn't discriminate against Indigenous peoples really, if they were business owners or if they were people, you know, community people, healthcare workers, or whether it be people who are, relatively distant from non-Native communities. The Spanish flu devastated Indigenous communities, and it took a few extra months to do so, but they still, when it arrived, it was almost impossible to stop. So by people looking at that particular time period and then adding that in with the history that I spoke about just a minute ago, which was this history of policies that driven Indigenous peoples into dire situations, where they're more capable to be affected by the sickness, just like how people disenfranchised communities for the rest of the country, people said, well, Indigenous peoples are going to be disproportionately affected. But yet, that didn't really happen. It didn't really happen, especially here in Manitoba. It did happen a little bit more in the east, and it did happen a little bit out in British Columbia. But the fact is that, for the most part, many First Nations, many Indigenous communities, both urban and rural, Métis communities in particular, they generally were not impacted as much, and certainly not to the expectation of what that looked like. And there's a really great paper written by Jolene Banning for the Canadian Media Journal on talking about why did Indigenous communities not get the first wave to the proportion that people expected. Now, this is not to say that people haven't been impacted. Of course they have been. Indigenous Services Canada has been reporting on those amounts. And in fact, the Yellowhead Institute out of Ryerson University, an Indigenous think tank, has been criticizing those numbers, even though Indigenous Services Canada has been reporting about 630 cases. It's now closer to 700, even just after a few days. It's likely that's higher. It's likely that's not including, for a number of reasons, First Nations don't report. The census never, the issues of the census, lack of appropriate data, self-declarations, and so on. We're going to talk about that at the end too. Now, the challenges is that even though there was a number of cases, Alberta being the highest, British Columbia being the second highest in terms of First Nations impacted, the bottom line of it is that it still did not reach the proportional amount that Indigenous peoples are of the country. And in fact, people expected it to be far worse and far more. Now, this is all worth noting because let's get this out of the way right away. Let's say that people would say, well, maybe the funding or all the money that was tossed at First Nations was the difference. Well, that's very little of that would be the difference. So, $305 million was the first initial Indigenous community support fund. There was a number of other funds created by the federal government to the tune of, 15 million here and 10 million there. And 305 million, when broken down, doesn't go very far at all. In fact, you can see how it's spread here across different provinces, First Nations and Métis, and so on. So if you were to sort of divide this up into First Nations and Métis communities, at the best, at the very maximum, it comes out to about 300,000 per First Nations community, without considering the bureaucracy of Indian affairs or Indigenous affairs, which often takes 1/3 of it. So let's just pretend that money is actually distributed to First Nations. And let's say that a First Nations, 640 plus First Nations, get $300,000 each. Well, what does that really pay for? That probably pays for one defibrillator, a nurse, probably part-time at that, and then some boxes of masks, some sanitizer, but in no way deals with the huge issues of infrastructure, the issues of distribution and health resources, consistent health resources, nor does it deal with the issues that involving protecting the community or assessing the community or testing the community. Like, that money goes nowhere. So money is not the solution, was not the solution here of why Indigenous communities were so successful in the early fight against COVID-19. And there's a really great piece that my colleagues, Gina Starblanket, who's at University of Calgary, Dallas Hunt, Cree guy from University of British Columbia, Gina Soto. Really great piece from the Globe and Mail early on in March, during the early days of the pandemic, which said the virus doesn't discriminate, but the responses to it does. So there was clearly a lack of impact funding-wise from the federal government to deal with the front lines of COVID-19. And while there was some addressing of that, it still wasn't an issue in which Indigenous peoples received the same kind of per capita funding that Canadians received in terms of their support for in the fight against COVID-19. There we go. Now, I want to show you what COVID-19 looks like on the ground. And we are talking really about Indigenous people's responses to pandemics. And this particular time period is a very interesting one because I've been dealing with it as a frontline worker. So I may be a professor and a writer for a newspaper, but I've been a frontline worker working with street people for about 20 years, since the 1990s. And so I guess 20 plus years now, when I worked with crisis units downtown, mental health units. And so, nowadays, however, I don't do that work anymore, but nowadays what I do is I work with a unit called the Mama Bear Clan. The Mama Bear Clan is not the same as the Bear Clan in the city. The Bear Clan is predominantly male run. It's run previously by a guy named James Fable. I've written a number of things about the Bear Clan and the incredible work that they've done over the years that they've been in operation, going all the way back, in fact, to the 1970s and 80s. But this is an organization that's fairly new, and the Mama Bear Clan is run by women, and it's run by the North Point Douglas Women's Center. You can see actually the center is just behind there in the green building. And it's run by grandmothers and aunties. And so this is right here, this is Jeannie Red Eagle. And right here, there's Karen. And there's Karen over here. And they run the captaincy on the nights that I walk. And meaning we take direction from the grandmothers, and they're part of the council of women that run the Mama Bear Clan in total. And these are my brothers over here, who we are the Shkabewis. We are the helpers of this walk. And so this is Todd and Todd. So weirdly enough, for some reason, we like double names in our team. I don't know what that's about, but there's Todd and Karen and Karen. And then there's myself. And like I said, there's Jeannie right there. Now, what we do at the Mama Bear Clan is we really have 3 outreach initiatives when we go out. The first is that we distribute food to people who are experiencing homelessness, and to people community people who are, often families, people with multiple children. Maybe they're in situations involving, difficulty having fresh fruit and good food to eat and so on. And so we distribute that throughout the community. We also distribute it on the streets, and we distribute it to the tent cities people who are living in tents in poverty areas in downtown Winnipeg. Second thing that we do is we do community cleanups of dangerous hazardous items, which involves needle pickup. You can see in my hand here, I'm one of the lead needle picker-uppers, I guess you would say. And we pick up anywhere between 50 to 150 needles per shift, and depending on what's going on particularly at that time. Now the third thing that we do is what the Bear Clan doesn't do, and also really what no other organization in Winnipeg does, and frankly very few nationally do, is that we deal with the mental health issues of Indigenous peoples involving trauma and engaging frontline trauma in that supporting Indigenous peoples in the mental struggle against colonialism, the mental trauma of racism and systemic racism, and probably most important of all is feelings of shame, and also people who are just having a hard time, living on the streets, having a hard time. Living in the community, having a hard time. And the Mama Bears Clan's job is to distribute medicine in the form of kindness and generosity, just like we are mandated to do by our relatives who live out in the non-human world, our bear relatives, and that they teach us about commitment. They teach us about taking care of our bodies. And most importantly, they teach us about generosity and respect. And they also teach us about, being fierce in the face of struggle, and not worrying about not worrying about what it is that you're fighting for, but that you do fight, that you stand up, that you engage, and that you do that to protect your children, you do that to protect your territory, and you do it because that is what you are, that is what life is about. And so as our bear relatives do, that's what we do when we walk the streets. And so yeah, it's a real honor to be a part of this team, and I don't pretend to be a leader in it. I am a captain, but I'm the Shkabewis. I'm a helper. And during the pandemic, we only allowed the captains to walk, and we normally have a volunteer group of 10, 15 of us. But during the pandemic, we just had the captains walk. So all of us here are different Shkabewis, and we take leads from Karen, and Jeannie. Now I'm just going to show you what happened in the very early days of the pandemic, even though. In Indigenous communities in Manitoba, there was no cases. There was no listed cases anyways. There was no listed cases, no active cases in First Nations, rural First Nations, or in urban Indigenous communities downtown. And there was, I think, one or two throughout the span of the pandemic from March to about June, 1 or 2 cases. Even though there was almost no cases in the Indigenous community in downtown Winnipeg, this is what was happening. This is the amount of needles that we picked up in one late May evening, about 350, and we picked that up in about 20 minutes in an area called the Thunderbird House, which is in downtown Winnipeg, which is supposed to be a cultural space there's a sweat lodge there. There's a lot of people who often use that space for visiting, and we picked up this amount of needles in one shift, and this was not the only shift that we got this amount of needles. This is probably the highest out of the entire summer, but 350 plus needles in 20 minutes was a remarkable find. And it was remarkable in such a way that it was actually very traumatizing for those of us on the patrol that night, because we couldn't believe how our relatives were struggling so much, and how much pain they were going through. And so it was a very hard thing. I remember I had a number of tears in my eyes, only because it's hard to see that for people who look like me and look like my relatives and look like the ones who are my uncles, my aunties. It was a hard time. But we persevered onwards, and we kept going. And one of the things that's most often, you can actually see it in this picture right here, that we offer to people on the streets is a smudge. We offer them medicine. And that's probably the most popular part of our walk. The food is nice. The community cleanup is nice. We get thanked for that. But really the smudge is the one thing that people most often respond really passionately to. Oh, there's a smudge. Oh, and they'll stop what they're doing and they'll come over. And people really get emotional, and they really, a lot of people have moments of their childhood, and they'll talk to us about their granny, and they'll talk to us about their relatives back home, and they'll talk to us about their children who are in the child welfare system and how much they miss them. And oftentimes what will happen is that through that smudge, people will open up and share very sacred things with us. And it's a really remarkable thing to experience. And so when we are offering that smudge to people, we can feel the impacts of trauma. And that is what we saw during the pandemic. We didn't see active cases, even though we had health supports, we had health regulations put into place, we wore masks all the time. But the impact of COVID-19 in our communities was strictly mental health. And this is nothing abnormal for the rest of Indigenous peoples across the country. While certainly there are communities that were deeply impacted and had dozens of cases, the amount of people that had mental impact and also economic impact, which led to mental health challenges on Indigenous communities, was massive. In fact, that was the pandemic. The pandemic of COVID-19 led to a pandemic of mental health challenges for Indigenous peoples. And one of the most stark things is I was on a panel with a number of people from across the country back in May, and there was Evan Adams. Dr. Evan Adams was from British Columbia, and he was speaking about the massive amount of suicide increases or the overdose deaths that were taking place in British Columbia. And so I hope you can see this little graph here. I just pulled it up so you can move my picture out of the way so that you can see in British Columbia, overdose deaths were doubling. Not only overdose deaths doubling, but also suicide attempts were doubling. And it's all because of mental health challenges. I mean, the stress that the COVID-19 pandemic led to. And it's important to note this little graph right here. This little graph here indicates to you for Indigenous participants, they were losing their job more often because Indigenous peoples were often blue-collar workers, often in frontline positions. Maybe they're working in grocery stores, they're working frontline security, they're working in the cases of my relatives, they were building buses, they're in blue-collar labor positions, custodians, and right away, first ones to be laid off. And so Indigenous peoples were experiencing economic loss, which led to mental health challenges. This is exactly what was happening on the streets. So we have to identify that COVID-19 is not just a physical pandemic, but it's a mental pandemic. And it's also a spiritual pandemic. It leads to feelings of apathy, of anger, of trauma, because the fact is that Indigenous peoples experience more trauma than anybody else. And that's just pre-pandemic. That's just generally. Indigenous peoples are 4 times more likely to have what's called severe trauma and then non-Indigenous peoples. When I'm talking about severe trauma, I'm talking about sexual physical abuse. I'm talking about chronic poverty, chronic sickness, for example, that runs through a family. I'm talking about higher risk for violence. All of this is, of course, due to colonialism. I've pointed that out before. It's due to a long history. We shouldn't be surprised whatsoever when a system is built in such a way where Indigenous peoples are seen as deficient, and then therefore they're put into positions in which they experience deficiency, or they experience risk, or they experience violence. So no surprise at all that colonialism is the cause of all of this. And the fact is that Indigenous peoples require the most amount of mental health supports in order to engage and deal with that trauma. But that is the thing that's most often lacking. There's a lack of service delivery, a lack of people trained to be able to deal with the challenges that mental health faces within Indigenous communities. And probably the most important of all is people can't afford those services, and they're often not supported, or they're very difficult to support. As a person who is frequently helping people on the streets, or people who are in chronically, poverty positions, I can tell you that the bureaucracy to get mental health systems paid for is immense. It is a impossibility to try to get a consistent mental health service for an individual, whether it be a child, whether it be an adult, whether it be a senior, from an Indigenous community at all. You've basically got to have money up front, and you've got to be able to pay for the services and then potentially get reimbursed later. It is very difficult to get mental health services. And so the bottom line is we have the massive issue of mental health, and then you put the pandemic right on top of that, and that leads to what is already traumatic symptoms into a exponential situation. And what does that look like on the streets? That looks like 350 needles in 20 minutes. That's what that looks like. That looks like tonight, in fact, we were out with the Mama Bear Clan, and we were doing our patrol tonight, and that looked like more and more people openly using on the streets. That looks like more and more people resorting to violence. Particularly one of the things we've noticed is the amount of triggers of violence most often happen more and more faster than they have in the past. It also results in more and more people looking for other ways to deal with the symptoms of trauma. Here's one thing I most often say to politicians and to those who work with homelessness. Housing is important, but it is not the solution. Shelters are important, but it's not the solution. More food on the streets is important, but not the solution. The solution is mental health. That's the solution. The evidence you only have to look at is with people who are living in tent city situations, for example, or they're living in close quarters with other people outdoors and for whatever reason. Here's why they do that. Here's why a shelter, not only is a shelter usually unsafe, particularly for women, but it's oftentimes a space that's very static. There's a number of really stringent rules, and people are encouraged not to have relationships. In fact, they're encouraged not to speak to one another. They're encouraged to stay distant to one another, oftentimes, especially now with COVID-19, at a great distance, a social distance to one another. And not only that, but then people are usually kicked out 8 a.m. in the morning and asked not to come back till 6 p.m. So in one shelter situation here in the city, we were able to extend those hours so that people can hang out during the daytime. And there's a bit of a community atmosphere within that space. And so, surprise, surprise, in that space, you're getting people who are most often staying long-term in that space. Surprise, surprise. Well, that's why people stay at Tent City. They stay at Tent City because they know they're going to be cared for. They're going to be looked after. They're going to be looking after each other. They're going to turn to one another, and they're going to deal with the trauma together. That's what solves homelessness. What solves homelessness is when people feel loved and supported and home. The cure to homelessness is a feeling of home. Now, let's think about for a moment what Indigenous ceremonies, creation stories, what we do as people. I'm an Anishinaabe. I was raised in the Midewiwin Lodge, and I've been in Midewiwin, which is a medicine person, for all of my life. I've been initiated into the first degree since 2006. And so, that's been a big part of my life for all of my life, but I've been going since I've been about 4 years old. And I've heard creation stories my whole life. In fact, my PhD is on Anishinaabe sacred stories and modern stories, or what we call the Adazukonic and the Debajamonan. And I can tell you that, there is no bigger theme than disease and sickness and strife in stories. I would say that almost every Indigenous creation story has an element of sickness within it, or has a challenge of strife or fighting or conflict. And then the ultimate goal for our creation stories is, how do we deal with those things? Like, how do we reconcile those things? How do we have a ceremony? In fact, that is what ceremonies is all about. Ceremonies is about unity through conflict. It's like we have a conflict, we have complexity, we have differences, and then we have a ceremony, and then we have a sense of unity or a sense of understanding or a sense of reconciliation coming out as a result. That is the whole premise of who we are as Anishinaabe, as Cree, all the other nations that I've been exposed to. I've never not seen this theme in action. In that, in our creation stories, we constantly have challenges, most often strife, sickness, violence. And how do we get through that And then most importantly, how do we come out better as a result? And if you look at this painting right here, this is the famous painting that Daphne Ojig did in the 1970s, or maybe early 1980s. It's called The Indian in Transition. And it's a mural in 4 parts. You can see pre-contact, which is kind of over here. You can see contact. You can see sort of the residential school period, and then you could sort of see the modern period here. And so this is a perfect example of what it looks like to, talk about Indigenous life in the most holistic way, and not really just a linear way, because you can see there's multiple ways the painting is operating. It's asking you to read and right to left as much as left to right. And there's some really great stuff in here. But I just want to point out that most of the images in the early stages of contact involve sickness and involve strife and involve looks at the feelings of sadness or looks of trepidation. And particularly in the residential school period, you can see just a great amount of pain, suicide, institutionalization, violence. And then at the end, here is the image of some kind of sense of unity or reconciliation or a sense of tomorrow, a sense of the future. Not all perfection, but certainly a sense of movement. And I think I maybe cut this off a little bit because of my thing here. But okay, let's just look at this as a creation story out of Zukonic, and some major themes come out. The first is that sickness is just a natural part of life. You can't avoid sickness. It's more like, can you prepare for it? Number 2, medicines are found in the world around us, and particularly the earth. So if we look to the earth, our clans, water, our roots and our plants, our animals, we will find the medicines. The medicines will be available to us. Third, that health involves a complete sense of self. It's not just saying we have physical health. We also have to have mental health. We have to have spiritual health. And we also have to have a sense of identity, a sense of fullness, or a sense of purpose. If we have those things, then we can say we're living a full sense, our heart, body, mind, spirit. Oftentimes it's used the kind of stereotypical medicine wheel, but it's really, just a good way to think of all of your life. These are the parts of who you are. There's a physical body, there's your mind, your mental health, there's your spirit or your feeling of yourself, or your sense of purpose, and then there's your heart. There's your kind of feelings of identity, your feelings of connection, your feelings of hope. All of those things are found in the earth around us, and that's where the medicine is found. That's where the engagement that's where we get full. Health involves the entire sense of self, and when we beat the sickness, the way we beat the sickness, and this is probably the most important thing about this particular creation story, is it's found in community. It's found when people come together. That our creation stories tell the story of when we face adversity, sickness, violence, struggle, strife. It is by turning together that we find solutions, that we are able to enact that solution. Turning together means we enact it. Now, I'm not the only one to talk about sickness, and I'm certainly Anishinaabe aren't the only ones. If you look at Lone Dog's Winter Count, for example, from the 1840s, which are images on hide that the Lakota people had recorded, you can actually find images of people dealing with sickness, smallpox in particular. So you can check that out. And there's people who talk about that in our communities all the time. If you look to our treaties, for example, our treaties are all about how we deal with sickness. We wrote it within the agreements that we had with other people. Treaty 6, for example, is talking about a medicine chest clause of how do we ensure that our treaties will have protection for our physical well-being, because the fact is that treaties were most often exploited by the federal government, and that treaties were meant to withhold goods in order to manipulate and control communities. And Treaty 6 was trying to engage the devastation of the end of the bison, which led to starvation. And when I was a kid, I remember the biggest lie that was ever told to me was that Indigenous people somehow didn't have they had deficiency, or they didn't have the ability to withstand disease. But the fact is that the Plains Cree, the Swampy Cree, were the healthiest people in the entire world. They had the longest lifespan, and it had nothing to do with deficiency. In fact, they were the superior people of the world. They're far more healthier than anybody in Europe. And James Dashik writes about that in his book, Clearing the Plains. But in one generation, with the end of the bison leads to starvation, which then leads to sickness. And so the people in northern Saskatchewan, northern Alberta came together and wanted a medicine chest clause in order to be able to engage the sickness, the smallpox sickness, but then other sicknesses as well, TB, which were entering into our communities and devastating and killing entire communities virtually overnight to the tune of 90%. So the fact is that there perhaps is nobody better to be able to deal with a pandemic than Indigenous people. Like, Indigenous peoples might be the most equipped people in Canada to deal with sickness, because we've been doing it since our creation story, since the very day one, since our very creation of who we are. So, like, no surprise that who dealt with COVID-19 swiftly, often declaring states of emergency before provincial governments. Who was it that enacted roadblocks and check stops in order to ensure that the sickness wasn't entering into communities? It was Indigenous communities. Who was it instituting, deep protection measures that were far more protective than often cities and towns? It was Indigenous communities. No surprise, because we have been dealing with sicknesses and strife and struggles and violence for thousands of years. We know how to do it. There's almost no one who knows more about it. And there's been lots of studies that have been produced, and so I encourage you just to check these out. There's lots of really great scholarship that's being produced around COVID-19. The Yellowhead Institute is a good spot. You can go check it out. Ryerson University, a group of young scholars doing some great work over there. There's also some really great stuff that's been done elsewhere in different other places. So this one was a study just in the United States, in Seattle, but very influenced according to the West Coast. And I really like this report because it says, what are some ways that Indigenous peoples modified their traditions to see that Indigenous ways can continue, but the modification of those traditions meant that you are strengthened as an Anishinaabe or as a Coast Salish person. And I really like these reports here. I just like to go talk about my own experience. So when my own experience, in my community, for example, or my family's community, so my daughter and my daughter's mother comes from Saging and Opaskwayak Cree Nation, and I have family from Norway House. So I saw all of my communities where I was coming from, all of my relatives, my aunties, my uncles, doing remarkable medicine picking projects. And probably for the first time in history, there became a sense of urgency in our communities to take what had been sort of a slow developing food sovereignty projects and then make them into food medicine and distribution projects in a community. And so not only do our communities, young men now suddenly going out on the land, maybe for the first time, but that young women with their cookums, with their aunties, with their uncles, they were going out and collecting medicine. And then both of those groups were coming back and then distributing them in the community. It was a remarkable thing to watch. And it was one thing that I saw most frequently within communities. I also saw really cool kind of online social media projects. And so there's a really great project that was produced, I think it was Northern Ontario, where people were doing hashtag supports of seniors, Indigenous seniors, residents, cookums and mushums, and they were coming together and they were creating hashtags to remind young people to wear a mask and to self-isolate, and they're putting that on social media for people in the community. And at the University of Manitoba, as well as many other universities, we held a graduation powwow online. Of course, ours was indoors. I spoke at it, but it was online. And so it was really interesting to watch the first powwow I'd ever experienced online, and kind of literally hundreds of people all coming together to celebrate our graduation. And we have the largest graduation of any campus across Canada of Indigenous students. And so we, witnessing that as kind of a cool development from the pandemic. There's many other projects as well too. There's really great projects that are being done in the language right now. So a lot of people who are working in the language. This is a remarkable art piece by Beth LaPense, who's a graphic novelist and an artist, and she produced a series of posters on wearing masks and how to be considerate of your elders. There's some great projects on comedy that's been produced, and one of the things that's been reminded us the most is that humor is the way that we've always dealt with sickness, and always the way that we've dealt with conflict in our communities in any way. And so comedy has been this kind of ongoing force in our stories. I think about funerals that you go to in my community in Peguis, for example, and how they're probably the funniest event I've ever been at. And so maintaining our comedy is maintaining our spiritual self. And, and many of the things that I've seen for bead workers, the amount of explosion of bead workers, people learning beadworking for the first time, now being at home. There's an amazing project with the Create to Learn people, which was tied up with Imaginative. And I think it was called Taking It Global, and they partnered with Imaginative. And what they did was they offered funding for young people or artists to offer videos for young Indigenous peoples at home. And so you saw hundreds of videos. You can check them out. Look up Taking It Global, Imaginative Initiative, and they made a bunch of videos. I made a video on how to write nonfiction, how to write for newspapers, and so there's hundreds of other videos on how to edit videos, how to do beadwork, how to pick medicines, how to make a website, those kinds of things. And so, seeing all the work the bead workers are doing in terms of fashioning masks and making masks beautiful, it's been a remarkable thing to watch as well. I want to talk a little bit about how Indigenous peoples have been innovating health and how they've been innovating the health institutions. And I think Manitoba has led, like many times, there's a reason why Manitoba and Saskatchewan are consistently and continually always the first to initiate projects. While Thunder Bay sometimes gets around to doing one or two new initiatives that everybody kind of gets on board for, Toronto occasionally, BC occasionally, it's consistently Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And a large part of that is because we form such a large proportional basis of our communities, but there's also a lot of Indigenous professionals. The most amount of Indigenous professionals graduate from the University of Manitoba, University of Saskatchewan, and then all the other campuses in between there, Brandon University, Red River College, University of Saskatchewan, I think I said, University of Saskatchewan, University of Manitoba, the two largest campuses, Regina also in there too. It's important to note that what happens in Manitoba most often will happen elsewhere. We're like sort of the litmus test of other places. And in Manitoba, for example, one of the things that's been the biggest challenge is a mistrust of Indigenous peoples and healthcare. Rightfully so, because frankly, healthcare is one of the most racist institutions in the country, in the province. And I can only tell you a few stories about, there's a guy named Brian Sinclair in Winnipeg who was a young Indigenous man, uncle age, who went to a hospital to get some service. He was in a wheelchair and he stayed there for over 30 hours and eventually died in the emergency room because nobody helped him. Nobody even talked to him. And there's a number of other cases as well involving sterilization of Indigenous women, forced sterilization. There's also many other cases of Indigenous families getting inappropriate treatment, disrespectful treatment involving Jordan's principle. So there's tons of reasons why Indigenous peoples, if they go to a hospital here in Manitoba, you would never self-declare that you're an Indigenous person. Of course, you may look it, you may get identified, but you'd never self-identify. And that leads to a host of issues involving tackling the issue of COVID-19 in communities. And so what the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, with several other organizations, Manitoba Wîcihitowin, that's the Northern Chiefs Organization, the Southern Chiefs Organization, got together with a number of other institutions, particularly the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat, and then also the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority and other forces. And what they said is, we have to tackle this sickness right away. And they proactively created a system in which when people self-declare, that information will be directly distributed and held within the Secretariat and the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And that will be therefore held in confidence, confidentially, and it will be made aware to those who self-declare that it will be First Nations held information. This has been a critical project in the fight against COVID-19, because what it's done is it's created a security for Indigenous people, First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, to know that their data is being handled by First Nations people. And then every Friday, Indigenous organizations release the information on their own means, through their own sites, through their own social media channels, so that Indigenous peoples are getting Indigenous specific information in order to be most equipped to deal with the issues in their communities. Now, as I mentioned before, the numbers have been very low in Manitoba, but just as I say that, the numbers over the past 14 days, we've gotten our first cases on First Nations. We're getting exponentially more cases as a result of impacts of people coming back into the workforce as Manitoba was loosened up and businesses opened up again. Those Indigenous peoples went back to work and then brought those impacts and those active cases back to communities. And so we're seeing it more and more probably than ever. And, while Manitoba is only still going through the first wave, like the sickness way back in 1919 for the Spanish flu, we're seeing the exponential growth on First Nations communities, but yet still not at the tune of anything else. And you ask yourself, like, why is that? Like, why is that consistently and continually being an important aspect of the protection and the fight against COVID-19? Well, it's because of Indigenous peoples standing up, doing what we have always done, which is following our stories and following the lessons within who we fundamentally are of what we've always done to deal with sickness, which is that, as our stories have taught us, we must take care of the fullness of our bodies, our mental health, our spiritual health, our heart health, as well as our physical health. We cannot just deal with our physical health, but we must, like we do with the Mama Bear Clan, go on the streets and tell people that they are loved. We must go on the streets and we must offer them the generous gift of kindness in that smudge. And we must offer people the risk of our time and our space and trust them. Believe in our relatives that we can do this together. And in our creation stories, we're most often taught about coming together and struggling through things together and ceremonially coming together to enable us to deal with the fight together. And yes, we also, if we look at the history of dealing with pandemics in our communities, we had quarantining measures, we had healthcare, ways to sanitize our food, for example. And that's what smudging is. It's an antibacterial agent for the air. We had all of these things, but yet we still turn to each other to commit to one another more, to focus on the earth and the medicines within the earth and those around us, to look towards the fullness of our body, and to always think that and know that when we work on this together, that we will get through it. And that's what we do at the Mama Bear Clan. That's why, frankly, during this pandemic, whether it be this example of the Mama Bear Clan, whether it be the example of people picking medicines or creating hashtags or holding online powwows or making posters or telling stories to laugh, or whether it be people doing beadwork or sharing information online, the fact is that if we continue to be Anishinaabe and live in the ways we always have, it might just be the best weapon against COVID-19. The most important weapon of all, which is the one thing that Canada has tried to beat the most out of us, it will be the thing that will not only save ourselves, but by enforcing who we are, by maintaining who we are, and by expressing our sovereignty. When those check stops were made way up north, when those events happened within our communities where Indigenous peoples stood up and engaged, check stops, for example. In Manitoba, they were taking place through highways and places, check stops everywhere. And some people in Manitoba complained about not being able to access their cottage. And the RCMP was like, we don't know what to do about so many of them. We're overstretched. We can't deal with them. You know what happened? Indigenous peoples, First Nations people saved Manitobans. And it was through the expression of sovereignty. And it wasn't people staying on their little plots of reserve land. It was going onto roads and highways, often in the traditional historical use of their territories. Those territories, they've been used for thousands of years. And through the protection of sovereignty, through the enactment of sovereignty, every Manitoba benefited. Let me say that again. Through First Nations sovereignty, through Indigenous expressions of sovereignty, everybody benefited. We stopped the sickness. We saved all of us. That's what we need to do now. What we need to do is take our stories, enact our truth, and most importantly, come together, even socially distant, come together ceremonially, spiritually, in every way possible, and focus on each other into the future. We'll beat this thing. We'll beat this thing together. And if we continue to commit to ourselves, commit to our communities, commit to our teachings, we can do that. So with that, I say miigwech for your time. I can't say thank you enough to all the organizers of the Wîcihitowin conference, and for all of us. I wish you all nothing but the best. Best wishes. I hope you all are safe, and that you're all able to keep your families safe and wonderful. And for those of you that are feeling, sad, or that you've been impacted by the sickness, I wish you nothing but the best for your family, and that I hope that you take good care of one another. Miigwech, everybody, for your time and for including me in this beautiful conference. And normally I'd say we can open up for questions or comments, but it's all online now, and we're taping this. So I'll just say a sign off now from Treaty 1 territory. Miigwech, everybody. Take care.
Big shout out.
Thank you very much, Niigaan.
Thank you, Niigaan.
We did our best to imitate what I'm sure everybody is doing on the other end of their computers, and what normally would have happened had we all been in the room gathering. Thank you very much. I think if you were anything like me, hopefully you had your pen and your paper.
Yeah,
out,
lots of notes.
taking notes.
Lots of notes.
Filled with solutions, answers, motivation.
Going forward, future, thinking towards the future.
And again, too, I think hopefully after taking that in, I think hopefully we built that presentation up enough.
Yeah.
I don't think, it's pretty hard to do that, though. I think I have a couple of comments, but I want you to offer some feedback first.
Neil's gonna let me speak first.
Yes,
Thank you,
please.
Neil. Okay. Niigaan, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. Title, Through Pandemics and Trauma, Why Indigenous Futures Cannot Be Stopped. I think that really covers it all. Going through, like he said, 500 years or more of oppression, of residential schools, of 60s scoop, of missing and murdered Indigenous women, of, on and on and on. And also, this is not in the past. This is in the present. These are things that are happening now. I think it's so timely. And how, of course, the importance of going through a time of pandemic, of COVID, and how that affects all communities, but in particular, those communities who sometimes are pushed to the side and are not remembered, people that we forget. So Niigaan is there, he is out in the streets. I think that's one of the things, after we read his bio and all of his accomplishments, Niigaan still stays connected to the community, to people. And I'm sure that's what informs everything he does and what he writes about. As we know, when you read his column, that's what's informing everything that he does and all the work that he does. Neil, I'm just going to tell a bit of a personal story.
Please do.
In about 2018, I was at the 30th anniversary of redress for Japanese Canadians in Winnipeg at the Human Rights Museum, and Niigaan was the keynote speaker there. And he spoke about redress and how redress is, it's a legacy of our ancestors. That it's not just about the money, but it's about giving back our identity and giving back who we are, and to not be ashamed of who we are because of the color of our skin. And I just, there were so many things that Niigaan said that day that so resonated with me as a Japanese, third generation Japanese Canadian. He also talked about Indigenous people and how, as long as you're taking up their energy to prove injustice, it's very, very hard to find reconciliation, to find healing. If you're constantly, having to share the trauma, and also to prove, right? And even, throughout a lot of what we do at Wîcihitowin, we're often, that is what we're doing too, right? We're trying to convince people, this is real, this is what's happening. It's not just in the past, it's happening now. And Niigaan talked so much about all of that when he shows, the picture of the pail filled with needles that they found in 20 minutes. And he says, it hurts him so deeply because he sees the faces that look like him, the faces of his family, the faces of his relatives and friends. And he says, it really stops him. And I think these are the things that we really need to be aware of. And I speak to, as a non-Indigenous person, that I need to be aware of as well. And so, those are some of the things that really resonated with me, connecting to the past with what I had heard him say before. He's just he's such a sincere and heartfelt speaker. He speaks from the heart. He's compassionate. And I think that's one of the reasons we so wanted him to be part of the Wîcihitowin conference.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think some of the admiration that I have for him is I'll probably talk about it over the next couple of days.
Yeah.
But I think, as someone who's transitioned over to a little bit more of an academic setting, I find myself teaching from the academy and there. But I think how we always used to pick on those that worked in universities and those settings is that coming from the field, it was always easier for someone to tell you just how to fix things, right? I found one of the things levels of respect that go up in respect to Mr. Sinclair is that not only does he teach in the academy, but he also, laces up his boots and hits the streets too, I really like that as well too. So those are the type of leaders that I like to follow, the ones that aren't just going to tell you what to do, but are actually going to say, this is how you do it, and are going to be joining you out there. And during these tough times, I think one of the things I hope everybody, has all of the comforts that make you, because some of these stories are going to be triggering. Some of these images are going to be triggering. And that's one of the things we've realized while doing and hosting and facilitating these types of conversations is that we know that it's hard sometimes. Suffering isn't easy. We're actually in the middle of this pandemic and it's brought a lot of stress. Mr. Sinclair Niigaan pointed out, sometimes what does that stress actually look like? And it's very powerful. So I think that there's a lot to take in. For those of you, that may be logging in and out of this, because I know there's a lot of people that are actually at work right now doing this types of thing. We want to know and let everybody know, let all your colleagues and friends know that we will be posting all of these presentations to the website after the conference. So wîcihitowin.ca is where folks can find all of the presentations, and also for the past couple of years as well too, for those that we've been given permission to share. But we are going into our first, we're going to segue into our first break. We've got lots of exciting stuff for you this afternoon. So we hope everybody can take a nice break, get caught up, maybe answer a couple of emails, but hopefully eat. Please take care of yourself. Please go and connect to the land. One of the things we're trying to build in many breaks so you can actually go out and connect and hopefully recharge.
We also wanted to, Neil, acknowledge the Wîcihitowin patrol here in Saskatoon, which is the equivalent of the Bear Clan in Winnipeg, and the great work that they do. And thank you also to all of those people, the viewers who are watching from across the country. We have Kim Kakakaway from Calgary, we know is all set up and watching. So we'll give shout outs during the next 2 days to all kinds of people, just to thank them so much for sharing with us these 2 days.
So please keep the chat active, keep plugging on social media.
Twitter,
Let's
tweet
start,
out, please tweet out.
Get some of those hashtags out, get some of that tweets out, and more shout outs to my friends from Skowhegan, Lorna and Eugene Arcan. We hope you're watching. Judy Pelly, we know you're watching out there as well too. So keep the chat active. We're going to be looking at that throughout the couple of days, but please enjoy your lunch and watch your email for the next